So I wanted to just share with you that I'm coming to this topic of trauma with a little bit of background, actually, in a couple of different areas. One is an academic background. I just finished my doctoral degree in October of 2021, and my dissertation was on an aspect of trauma experienced in the context of church. It was about um, I called it Sexual Abuse by Clergy and How It Affects. This isn't the title of the dissertation. It was a much longer title because dissertation title is very long, but it's on an aspect of trauma that is acquired from sexual abuse by clergy. So I basically studied trauma for 3 years in my doctoral studies, and I know a lot about it from an academic standpoint because of that. Of course, there's a lot more I need to learn. But I also know about it from a personal standpoint, from an experiential standpoint. And the reason I arrived at the subject of sexual abuse by clergy is because early in my Christian experience, I experienced something like that. What happened was I joined a ministry. I'm in my 20s, mid 20s, very young person. I joined a ministry that was directed by a highly charismatic, gifted individual, but unfortunately, the man was narcissistic and abusive, sexually abusive, and preyed upon all the women in the ministry, not just me. And I had two encounters with him that were basically a form of assault, sexual assault, not rape, but him coming at me, wanting physical contact, and me having to physically fight him off to keep him from that. And then I experienced talking to leadership that had the power to do something about this man and having them instead decide that either it was my fault or I must have misunderstood or something like that. And that's, by the way, called institutional betrayal, when the organization behind an abusive person sticks up for them instead of listening to the victims. Well, all of that was extremely traumatic and extremely difficult for me to get through as a young Christian. But I came out on the other side of it with a real burden to help people prevent sexual abuse in church, and then also to respond to it appropriately instead of the way I saw it responded to. And so that's a line of work that I'm involved in as the result. God brings a testimony out of our test, and he brings ministry out of our misery, right? And so he was able to do that with the whole topic of sexual abuse by clergy. And so I'm talking to you tonight, not just from the standpoint of an academician, but I'm talking to you tonight from the standpoint of a human being who's been around for a long time, who has experienced some mistreatment and even abuse. And so if you're one of those people also who has experienced abuse, who has experienced mistreatment, I want you to know I'm in solidarity with you. I'm your sister, and I know how you feel. And that's where I'm coming from as I share what I'm going to share tonight. All right, so let's look at the slides that I have here. I'm really thankful I can be part of the New Life Seventh-day Adventist virtual mental health summit. You guys have done a beautiful job at organizing this and making it work, and I hope it blesses your people a lot. All right, so we're going to be talking about emotional trauma this evening, and I want to just jump right into a definition of trauma. There are a couple of different diagnoses that come out of traumatic experiences, and of course, the most common one is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. I want to explain to you what it is. Basically, to achieve a diagnosis of PTSD, one must have exposure to a life-threatening or otherwise very dangerous situation, or they have to have had that exposure through a close friend or relative. So basically, a brush with death, if you want to call it that. The most common causes of PTSD, the most common cause is motor vehicle accidents. But the second and third are active combat in war, and then sexual assault for typically women. So that exposure to a life-threatening or otherwise threatening event is a criteria for a diagnosis of PTSD. What happens and what we think happens as the result of this overwhelming experience is the individual does not process that memory adequately. Something goes wrong with the memory processing. Normal memory processing involves taking the emotional charge out of the memory so that the memory can be filed in the brain without the person re-experiencing all that emotion each time they recall it. I remember talking to a friend of mine who'd been through a very severe accident, and she could talk about it with a smile on her face because she had processed that emotionally and she was not traumatized by it any longer. Well, something goes wrong with that process in PTSD, and people find it difficult when they recall the event not to re-experience the event. And so as a result, they'll often have various memory events, such as nightmares, flashbacks, and this type of thing. We think it might be the brain trying to bring that thing back into our awareness so that we can thoroughly process it. Then there needs to be also emotional dysregulation. What we mean by dysregulation is your emotions are going all over the place. They're not really obeying your thoughts, and you feel extremely emotional, basically, is what that feels like. Flooded with emotion is another way to say that. And typically that means flooded with catecholamines, which are stress hormones, which flood the body when we are emotional. Often anxiety and or depression accompanies PTSD, and then also patterns of avoidance. And this is one of the aspects of PTSD we can do something about. And good treatment for trauma always involves a structured approach to facing not the actual threats. We have to separate the threats from the triggers. So if you were assaulted by a tall man with brown hair, you avoid that man. That's a threat. But avoiding all tall men with brown hair that's a trigger right there. So what we do with PTSD treatment is we teach people how to face their triggers. And so avoidance is a very common feature of PTSD. And that's one of the things we try to overcome. And then also dissociation, where the person checks out, where they're present, but they're not totally present. And maybe they don't even know who they are. They don't know where they are. This is a feature of the mind that helps people get through an overwhelming situation, but it's not really a healthy thing to have ongoingly in your life. So we want to also address that in treatment. Now, there's a related disorder that isn't classic PTSD that is typically characterized by an encounter with a life-threatening event. CPTSD has more to do with micro assaults over a longer period, and typically it happens in the home of origin when the home is characterized by various forms of chaos and or abuse and or addiction. What happens is that vulnerable child is subjected to these micro assaults. Maybe they're not severe, overwhelming traumas, but they're little traumas that tend to compile over time. So to compare PTSD with CPTSD would be, PTSD would be me socking you in the jaw and knocking out a tooth. That would be a one discrete event that would be overwhelming and cause severe injury. CPTSD would be me slapping you on the cheek for 5 days in a row. And of course, that would get very sore and even infected and cause an injury as well. So CPTSD typically isn't characterized by one dramatic event that occurred, but a number of different events. But it has the same ultimate effect on the mind. It disrupts the ability to build trust, to calm oneself down. We learn in our home of origin how to self-calm by our mother helping us calm down, and that builds neural pathways. And if those neural pathways are not built with mother, they're harder to come by as adults. And then identity formation tends to be an issue with people that have experienced CPTSD. Stable, healthy relationships are often more difficult. Self-comforting and self-calming become more difficult, and many resort to self-blame and shame as a means of feeling like maybe they're in control. Because if you blame it on yourself, that implies that there was something you could do about it and you can prevent it from happening again. So we often see children blaming themselves for their parents' divorce or their parents' abuse or whatever, that's an effort to shrink the problem down to a manageable size, we think. Now, one of the individuals that was responsible for helping us understand CPTSD is Dr. Vincent Felitti. Dr. Felitti was working with Kaiser Permanente weight loss clinic, and he noticed that that many people dropped out of the clinic even though they were losing weight. So he decided to do some follow-up research, and he was talking to a young lady one day who had dropped out of the clinic. And he was tired, and instead of asking her, at what age did you have your first sexual experience? He asked her, how much did you weigh at your first sexual experience? And she said 45 pounds, and he got really confused. And then he asked the question again, and she looked down at the floor and she said, it was my father. And in that moment, Dr. Felitti realized that the reason people were dropping out of the weight loss clinic was because they had turned to food as a way of self-medicating against trauma, and they didn't want to give it up because it's the only thing that made them feel better. So here he's speaking about the relationship between what he called adverse childhood experiences and mental health. Our study of the relationship of adverse childhood experiences to adult health status in over 17,000 persons shows addiction to be a readily understandable, although largely unconscious attempt to gain relief from well-concealed prior life traumas by using psychoactive materials. In other words, it's people turn to drugs to self-medicate against trauma. What they found in the follow-up research on adverse childhood experiences is that a disproportionate number of individuals who had experienced adverse childhood experiences also experienced disrupted neurodevelopment. And then a disproportionate number of those people experienced social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. And then adoption of health risk behaviors. And then disease, disability, and social problems, and then early death. Obviously, this is a very depressing picture. I want to encourage you, it doesn't mean everybody that's had adverse childhood experiences is going to die young, because notice this is a pyramid. It's not a square. So it says that the effect does taper off with each layer, but a disproportionate number of people do follow this sequelae of events. So I want to give you an example of someone who did. His name was Tom. He had alcoholic parents. He had an abusive father. He was molested by his uncle at age 6. He developed an anger problem, very common side effect of molestation. He couldn't concentrate. He got into gang life by the time he was 16. He married Jenna at 24, but he drank too much. He actually got rough with her one day, beat her up. She left him. He ended up developing depression. He ended up turning to food and alcohol to self-medicate. He withdrew from people. He developed high blood pressure because of the diet and the alcohol, and then heart problems, and died at 49 years old. Died too young. And if you look, it all started with his abusive father, his alcoholic parents, his alcoholic parents, and his uncle molesting him. In other words, childhood trauma gave birth to all these processes and led to his early death. You know, the servant of the Lord says that 9/10 of all diseases begin in the mind. She doesn't say they're in the mind. They don't end in the mind. They begin in the mind. And I think she meant something like this, that because of these traumas, he came to certain conclusions about life, about himself, about other people, that ultimately led him into these very harmful behaviors. Now, I want to encourage you, because I think people have options. Just because we experience childhood trauma doesn't mean we're going to end up dying at 49 years old. You know, the Lord says in his word that he will restore the years that the cankerworm has eaten. There are many promises in scripture that promise that God can overcome evil with good, that they meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And I'm going to quote some of those promises in a few moments here, but let's look first at what happens to the brain in trauma. I think what happens is the brain kind of, in a way, softens and becomes vulnerable to the suggestions of the enemy because of the emotional overwhelm, and the cerebral cortex isn't working as effectively. The brain can kind of become very susceptible to lies. And the lies are typically in the arenas of lies about ourselves, lies about other people, lies about the future, and lies about God. So one of the things I do, in addition to the find, argue, and replace that I shared with you yesterday, is I help people identify what their core beliefs are. And this is the process that I follow. First of all, I persuade them to give themselves permission to feel. Often people want to just make their negative emotions go away. But for this exercise, you want to accept those negative emotions and just give them a space to exist for a moment. And then I have them label the emotion. And then I have them identify in what area of their body they feel the emotion, and then what intensity, scaling from 1 to 10. And then finally, what narrative would the feeling give if it could talk? What would it say about the future? What would it say about yourself? What would it say about God? And what would it say about other people? And often I'll have them journal on those questions. And that helps them identify their core beliefs, the things that are way down deep inside them that they may not even be aware of. Let me give you an example of this. Sarah is a graduate student, but she's flunking out of her classes, not doing well at all. And she sees a therapist, and the therapist teaches her how to correct her automatic thoughts. So she's thinking things like, I feel like a loser, I must be a loser. If you remember this from yesterday, that's called emotional reasoning. Either I get an A or I fail. That's black and white thinking. I should have stayed up all night to study is should focus. He got into Yale, I didn't, I'm a loser. That's unfair comparisons. Those people think I'm stupid, that's mind reading. So she's engaging in all of these distorted automatic thoughts, but she senses that there's something deeper going on. There's something way down deep inside of her that she's not even fully aware of. And so the therapist works with her through this process here, and she identifies the core belief that is affecting all these other beliefs is the belief that she has to be the best. She has to win every race. She always has to be the smartest guy in the room. You know, that's a really toxic belief. First of all, it makes life all about competition. But secondly, it's impossible to always be the best at everything. It's just not going to happen. So what Sarah realized was that she had been impacted by the way her mother raised her. You see, her mother had had to drop out of her graduate studies, her PhD program, when she got pregnant with Sarah. And she, from that point forward, pretty much lived her life vicariously through her daughter. And she told her again and again, you have to be the best, you have to win, you have to get straight A's, and really pressured her in a way that ultimately became harmful to Sarah. So Sarah finally realized that her core belief was, I have to be better than everyone else. And she changed that core belief from I have to be better than everyone else to I have to be my best. I don't have to be the best. I just have to be my best, do the best I can with what I have. So a lot of times what sets us up for vulnerability to developing PTSD or CPTSD are developmental factors. Not every trauma produces a predictable outcome. There's quite a bit of variance in trauma effects on different people. Women, for one thing, develop PTSD twice as often as men do. Women also have more depression, more anxiety. But there are also developmental factors, things that set people up in their childhood for being vulnerable to things like trauma. So some of the ways in which development affects us is explicit learning. Your parents teach you certain things, they tell you certain things, and those things become very deeply embedded in your psyche. That would be also training, and religious instruction would qualify as explicit learning. Much of the time that's going to be good and it's going to be healthy, But some of the time that's going to be dysfunctional. But then there's implicit learning, and that's often more dysfunctional than the explicit learning. Very few parents will tell their children, you have to be the best, but some parents act that way, and the child ends up absorbing that belief. Or very few parents will tell their children, you can't trust anyone ever under any circumstances. But many parents might model that behavior by being very distrusting themselves. So implicit learning is what the parent demonstrates to the child. And the observed behaviors, human nature is highly imitative. So human beings imitate the behavior of the human beings around them, particularly when that human being is a parent. We're going to be very impelled to mimic that parent. Now, the good news is that trauma can be overcome. So I want to talk to you a little bit about what we call post-traumatic growth. This is a very famous photograph. It's a photograph of villagers fleeing a South Vietnamese village. They'd been struck by a napalm bomb. The girl in the middle is Phan Thi Kim Phuc. She's called the Napalm Girl, and she's crying, Nong Quai, too hot, because her back is on fire. Phan Thi Kim Phuc went through many, many medical procedures to try to correct the damage that was done by the bomb. But many years later, she went to college and wanted to die. She became suicidal. She went into her library at college and found a New Testament. And she came to know a loving Jesus. And Jesus healed her heart of the bitterness and rage that she experienced as a result of being so damaged as a tiny child. She was able to find forgiveness for that. And today, she is an ambassador for goodwill. She wrote the book, The Girl in the Picture, co-wrote the book, and she speaks all over the world about post-traumatic growth and the power of the gospel. So the point is that trauma is part of the story, but it is not the whole story. There's a wonderful word in our Bibles in the original language. It's called katergesetai, and it means work down to the end point or bring to decisive finality. So it's a wonderful word meaning that something good is coming out of this thing. And we see it in passages like these. James 1:3, the trying of your faith works patience. Romans 5:3, tribulation works patience. And then 2 Corinthians 4:17, for this light affliction, which is but for a moment, works for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. In other words, my brothers and sisters, in God's hands, the trials and tribulations and even the traumas you experience can ultimately work for you. Notice that works for us. God can transform that trauma. You see, God can take evil and bring good out of it. If he couldn't do that, what would he ever have done with the crucifixion? What's the worst thing? What's the most evil thing that has ever happened? The crucifixion. Humanity murdered God. What's the best thing that's ever happened? The cross. God saved humanity. The crucifixion and the cross, the worst thing and the best thing are the same thing. But the cross is what God did with the crucifixion. You see, he can bring good out of evil. And so how much more can he do that with your lesser traumas? So let's talk a little more about post-traumatic growth. We found that people who experience it experience a greater appreciation of life, better relationships with other people, new possibilities in life, personal strength, and spiritual change. Very, very many benefits and really deep benefits. So I want to know, and I hope you want to know, what's going to make sure that I develop post-traumatic growth, because we can either get bitter or we can get better. We have a choice, and not everyone, although many people, but not everyone experiences post-traumatic growth. So how can we make sure that we experience that growth? Well, spirituality is a predictor. but it's the kind of spirituality that mattered, a spirituality that is based on the goodness of God, not the punitive aspects of God or the exacting, judgment aspects of God, although those are part of who he is. But when people let that color their entire picture of God, that becomes a problem, because then they see him as a being who delights in punishing, and that is not true. So our spirituality needs to be grounded in a beautiful picture of Jesus for it to have a benefit to us. Another predictor of post-traumatic growth is social support, the ability to be with other people. And then skip down to the fourth one here, opportunity for emotional disclosure. Typically, if you have good emotional social support, you can express your emotions to other people. And that's a really important part of emotional and trauma processing, is the ability to cry with people. And then acceptance coping is the ability to accept that something happened, even though you don't accept what happened. I will never accept that I was physically and sexually assaulted on the playground. I'll never say that's okay. I'll never say that's a good thing in and of itself. But I accept that it happened. I don't accept what happened, but I accept that it happened. And that's acceptance coping. Okay, this trauma happened. I can't undo it. I'm not going to focus on it. I'm not going to obsess over it. I'm not going to keep asking myself, why couldn't it have been different? I'm not going to blame God for it. I'm not going to blame others for it. I'm going to accept that it happened. And then I'm going to ask myself, what's the best way forward? See, that's empowering, because I'm asking about the present and the future, and that's going to help me feel powerful. Whereas if I dwell on the past, I'm going to feel more and more like a victim. A really important part of this is learning self-care. Often people who are raised in traumatic homes, for example, are neglected by their parents. They aren't treated well by others, and then they carry on that legacy into their adult life. So how important is it for us to treat ourselves the way God would treat us if he was our parent? And he is our parent, but if he was our kind of physically present parent. What we do in self-care is we treat ourselves well in behalf of God. Self-care is really just good stewardship. Present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. You are, your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. And so we take care of our temple, and that is taught often in scripture, that stewardship. And so self-care is really stewardship over our physical selves and over our emotional selves. Now, it seems to me that often people who've been traumatized don't take good care of themselves, and sometimes they beat themselves up a lot. And so I really like to use this analogy with people that have a tendency to do that. I say, now, if there was a rusty old bike in my yard and I said, it's useless, if I threw it in the dump, would that be okay? Yeah, sure, it would be okay. What about if I saw a rusty bike in my neighbor's yard and I thought that's useless and I threw it in the dump? Would that be okay? No, it would not be okay. Why would it be okay for me to throw away my own bike, but not my neighbor's bike? And they answer correctly, because you own your bike. And I say, the reason you throw yourself away, even though you would never throw another person away, is because you think you own yourself, but you don't. Jesus bought you with an infinite price, the price of his own blood, which is of infinite value. And in doing that, he said you were of infinite value. And so he is asking you now to treat yourself well in his behalf. And I find that if you present it that way, people often will start to learn self-care. So a really great way to start engaging in self-care is ask yourself the question, what do I enjoy doing that's also good for me? And whatever that is, do more of it, especially while you're in recovery. All right, let's talk in closing here about relationships, because a big part of trauma is relationships. In fact, there's kind of an inverse relationship. The healthier our relationships, the better we tend to deal with trauma. The more messed up our relationships are, the more dysfunctional they are, the more unhealthy they are, the less we tend to be able to get through trauma. So there are reasons for that. Let's look at human development here for a moment. You know, babies that are held and that are cherished and that are stimulated appropriately in terms of brain stimulation, those babies will develop better ability to connect with others in later life. And they will experience an improved ability to self-regulate. So basically, the mother cares for the infant. The mother helps the infant go from a very escalated, anxious state to calm and secure. And the mother does that over and over and over throughout the infancy and toddlerhood of that child, and builds those synaptic pathways over and over to where that child, when he becomes an adult, can soothe himself. So the it's okay from the mother on the infant becomes the it's okay on the young adult on himself. We tend to be able to comfort ourselves better when we've been comforted as children. But I want to encourage those of you that did not have good nurturing parenting. There's hope, and you're going to see that in a moment here. This is a beautiful statement from Sarah Jenkins. She is an LCSW, and she has a ministry called Recover Life. And she says, throughout our childhood, we are in a continuous dance of attunement with our primary caregiver, seeking a sense of security and connection, one that ideally provides us with the foundation to be able to maintain healthy relationships into adulthood. So you see that attunement between the mother and the child, or the father and the child, is going to ultimately become that individual's ability to have healthy relationships, because they're literally building the relational part of the brain. Don't get discouraged if you did not have good brain building in infancy, because this is Christina Brooks, who has also studied neuroscience, and particularly the neuroscience of relationships. And she says early brain development is not the end of the social brain story. In other words, if you didn't get it when you're a child, you can learn later in life how to love and be loved. I like to say it this way: steeper climb, bigger muscles. People who have had a disadvantage in childhood, didn't have good nurturing, good care, didn't build those synaptic pathways, they're going to have to be more intentional about building trust, about building the ability to self-regulate. And that's going to be a bit of a steep climb. But if you have a steeper climb, you're going to have bigger muscles and you're going to be stronger, or at least potentially you're going to be stronger in the end. You know, loneliness is a big problem. John Cacioppo out of the University of Chicago said that loneliness, and he said this a few years ago, was up from 20% in the 80s to as high as 40% today. Well, since the pandemic, that's gone up to 50%. Everything went up during the pandemic: anxiety, depression, trauma, substance abuse, all the mental health problems, because people were spending so much time alone, because being online just doesn't do it the same way being in someone's physical company does it. So part of the reason we're so lonely is because that relationship, that relational brain, wasn't built from the time we were young. See, this is the life timeline. And what God does with relationships is he builds our brain for love right there at the very beginning of life with our parents. And then we expand with each stage of development on the skill set from the previous stage. So the next stage is our relationship with our siblings, more of a horizontal relationship. And then finally, we jump from the family of origin to outside the family of origin. We take the skills we learned in our relationship with our siblings and we apply it to friendships, which require negotiation and conflict resolution and this type of thing. And then the friendship stage of our lives is really practice for finding that ultimate friend, our life partner, our spouse. And then we have children of our own, and hopefully someday, hint, hint to my own kids, grandchildren. Now, all of this is mediated through what we call mirror neurons. Every relationship you conduct involves these mirror neurons. They have this ability to help us feel what other people feel. And that's really the essence of friendship. And so mirror neurons are very, very important. They were first discovered studying primates. They would put electrodes on a monkey's brain and then measure what happened when he saw another monkey eating a banana. What they found is that the monkey with electrodes, the banana eating part of his brain lit up, even though he wasn't eating a banana. We call that empathy. It's the ability to feel what other people feel. And that's all mediated through those mirror neurons. And of course, we can develop in those things. So let me give you some pointers to close out here about making friends, because whether you're married or not, whether you have children or not, any and everybody should have friends. They're the constant relationship in throughout our lives. So let's talk about friend making first. Friend making involves valuing others, listening well. Some people feel they must talk all the time. No, the best kinds of conversations go two ways. It's like a volley back and forth on a tennis court or a ping pong table. You're going to give and you're going to take. You're going to listen, you're going to speak. To make friends, be courteous. Learn the art of courtesy, true courtesy, not the picky stuff that people do, but true courtesy where you put others first. You know, the word that is translated courtesy in the New Testament is an interesting word. It's philophron, and it means understanding your friends. That's what it means. Feeling the feelings of others often helps us to be better people, to be more courteous people and more considerate people. Good grooming is important for friend making. Be considerate of other people. Learn how to affirm people. You know, it's one thing to flatter, but it's another thing to give a compliment or affirm people. That you did a really great job at that. You look really good in that color. Thank you for parking in the right parking space or whatever. Learn to affirm people. It's very, very important to friend making. And if you affirm someone, they will like you. It really gets the good juices flowing. Empathize with others. Very important. Feel their feelings and let them know you feel what they're feeling. Be willing to give and take. Don't always be the benefactor or the benefactor, the one giving to other people. Be the beneficiary sometimes. Learn how to laugh. Don't laugh at inappropriate jokes, but laugh at people's jokes. Be very generous with your laughter. Hold on to that sense of humor. And then, of course, be yourself, because if everyone likes you and you're not yourself, you still won't feel secure. What about friend keeping? It's a little bit different set of skills. With friend keeping, we're going to have to move through conflict, because sooner or later, all relationships encounter conflict and pain and difficulty. So we're going to have to be able to move through that and stay strong, or at least rebuild the relationship through that. So allow for those challenges. Tell yourself the truth. There will be challenges in relationships. Be utterly honest with the other person. Have those hard conversations, like according to the gospel order of Matthew 18, which says that we should talk to our brothers and sisters one-on-one instead of processing with other people. As much as possible, resolve conflict. Overlook some things. You don't have to pick on everything people do. You could let some things go. My husband came in today and he put a really dirty comb in a jar of water. I have no idea why he did it, but I'm going to let it go. I'm not going to pick on him for it, not going to criticize him. I'm just going to hope he moves that thing off the counter in the bathroom. Overlook much. Exercise integrity in your relationships. Keep investing. Tends to be that we take people for granted when they've been around for a long time. Keep investing. Learn how to express your emotions. Be honest about what you're feeling. And then express your needs to one another so that your friends can know what you need. I want to give you some resources to follow up here. These 3 books are my attempt to really lay out carefully mental health from a biblical standpoint. So 13 Weeks to Peace, 13 Weeks to Love, and then 13 Weeks to Joy address various aspects of mental health and relationship health. And I encourage you to get those. They're very easy to find on Amazon, and they are, I believe, in Kindle version as well. This is a free series, 2 free series that are on my YouTube channel, 7 Deadly Psychological Sins and 7 Deadly Relationship Sins. They're just bad habits we develop and how to replace them. And then we're going to go into the website where you're going to find a lot of our resources, abide.network. Don't put a .com or a .org, just abide.network will take you to our website. It's a wonderful website. And if you want counseling or coaching, fill out the intake form. Then we have some freebies. I talked about this last night. Food for the Heart Bible studies on Fridays at 8 p.m. ET. That would be 5 o'clock your time. Here's the Zoom number. And then free telephone support groups, which are at various times. You should look on our webpage to find out when those are. We have some wonderful workshops. We have an anxiety and depression relief workshop that I encourage you to be part of. They are generally 6 weeks, once a week. And I do about an hour and 15-minute session once a week with the group, and then they study the material in between. And I find that this model of coming together as a community of healers and people healing is a really great way to get through teaching people about trauma and anxiety and depression. So it's a wonderful combination. You're learning, but you're also connecting. Project Safe Church is a training we do, a one-day training. It helps people learn how to prevent sexual abuse by clergy, and then also how to handle it when it happens. Try this at home marriage. We're about to start this weekend. The workshop is available virtually, and I'd be happy to send out a bunch of links after this is over so that you can just click on the link and go to the Eventbrite page. But this is a wonderful workshop that I'm doing this weekend. We're doing a kickoff event with David Asherick. He's going to be preaching on marriage. And then I'm going to do a follow-up workshop. So that's the sum of the resources that we have for you. And now I'd like to open up the floor for whatever questions you might have.